that, Ashley. And joining us now, former U.S. Trade Representative Steve Gill is joining me from Nashville to talk about this a little further. Steve, thank you for being with us today. First, as we know, trade talks are underway now in China, the first of 2 days of talks since the U.S. and China have now agreed to something of a ceasefire in the trade war until March 1st. China's economy has currently hit a sluggish point. How do you see this round of talks panning out?
Well, I think both economies have hit a little bit of a sluggish point, so both sides have an interest in trying to get something done sooner rather than later. The trade talks that are starting today are really the nuts and bolts people who are trying to craft out what higher level officials will be able to do when they actually get together. And while it's a relatively short time period between now and March, that is time to continue the progress that's been made, even during this sort of ceasefire, as you mentioned. We've seen the U.S. be able to renew sales of soybeans to China. They've actually started selling rice to China. China has backed off of their 2025 plan, and the U.S. has backed off of raising tariffs in anticipation of trying to reach a deal. So there has been progress made during the ceasefire. The question is whether or not it can be firmed up into an actual deal.
Now, I'm glad you mentioned high-level talks. This is supposed to be a mid-level talk, but there was a surprise visit by Liu He. He's the top economic aide to President Xi Jinping. There was a leaked photo out on Twitter of his surprise visit. Liu's the top negotiator for China. These talks were supposed to be this mid-level. So what does this surprise appearance by Mr. Liu indicate to you?
I think it shows that they have a real interest in trying to move these things along quickly. Now, the representative from the United States is the deputy U.S. trade representative, which means he's the #2 person for Lighthizer, the U.S. trade representative himself. So I think that you've got a relatively high level. This isn't just kind of the low level nuts and bolts folks way down the food chain. It is a high level from the United States, but I think the presence of high level and even higher level in China shows that both sides are going to be anxious to try and move something along. The president and President Xi will likely meet in Davos. They're going to have the World Trade Economic Summit in Davos, Switzerland later this month, and there's talk of a meeting in February between the two top leaders, even before we get to that March deadline. Even if we don't reach a firm deal, I think we're going to continue to see progress between China and the U.S., ratcheting down the tensions, and clearly the stock markets are going to like seeing the hopefulness of a deal between these two big economic powers.
Okay, now seeing that you have this background as a trade representative, you've been involved in talks like this. What do you make of the accusations against the Chinese tech giant Huawei that their technology is a front for spying? That can't help our trade talks, can it?
Well, I was a director of intergovernmental affairs, not a U.S. trade representative, but in that capacity got to see how deals get done. And one of the top priorities that the United States has is not just trying to make sure that our products, particularly agriculture products, are getting into China. China obviously has an interest in their manufactured goods continuing to come into the U.S. at low or no tariff ratings. But we're really concerned about intellectual property. You've talked about cyber theft, but it's also protecting the intellectual property, the creative products of the United States. And that's been a big stumbling block in the negotiations. The arrest of the top official at Huawei has made things more difficult. I think that you're going to see that kind of moved off the table as we get closer to a final deal. Although, again, the relations between the U.S. and China is not just limited to trade. You had a top Chinese general point out that they could sink 2 U.S. aircraft carriers and own the Asia-Pacific region. So that kind of talk, an arrest of a senior trade official for Huawei does not help negotiate a better deal in relationship with the companies.
And as you mentioned, allegations of China stealing American technology. How can American companies secure their trade secrets when they ultimately want to access the second biggest economy in the world, which is China?
Well, I think part of it has to be being aware that everything you do, everything you transfer to the Chinese is likely to be replicated. They have always done this. That's been a stumbling block for a long time. And I think one of the challenges between the U.S. and China right now is it is Chinese government policy for Chinese companies to gather as much data and information as they can, which is not necessarily spying. It is economic competition. And the U.S. doesn't play quite as well in that game as some of our competitors around the world.
Looks like we're going to have a long road to haul ahead of us here. Thank you so much for joining us today, Steve Gill.
Thanks, Manila.